listeners of the Mad Scientist podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cogswell, here with another in our series of interviews of interesting people involved in either deep into the UFO community or slightly on the fringes of it, maybe looking into the inside of that community from a more journalistic standpoint. And today we are joined by Sarah Scoles. Sarah is a science journalist. She has written for all kinds of different places, Wired Science, Popular Science. She wrote the book Making Contact, Jill Tarter and the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and is just, I think, overall a fascinating person to talk about this stuff with. Sarah, how are you doing this morning?
I'm pretty good. How are you doing?
Doing pretty well, just trying to make sense of the Bob Lazar documentary, or the not the documentary, but the autobiography now coming out.
Yeah, aren't we all? I haven't perused its pages yet, but looking forward to.
Yeah, from what people have told me already, kind of people that, as soon as it came out, bought it and listened all the way through, which I think is just a Herculean task on its own. It's basically the same story. You know what I mean? It's what you expect Bob Lazar to say, which, if there's one thing about Bob Lazar, he has been consistent about his story. But so has George Lucas. Doesn't make the story true.
Right.
Anyways.
Right. Yeah. It's convenient to have a pretty unfalsifiable story and to just be able to tell it over and over.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, I actually think back, when I was a kid, I somehow, and maybe this was like the defining moment where I chose good over evil. But I'll never forget, I convinced a friend that I was a Power Ranger. Like, I was actually a Power Ranger. I don't think I actually convinced him, of course. But I was like, no, I'm a Power Ranger. And like for a day, I was like, no, I could call my Zord like anytime. Like, it's going to happen. I'm the beige one, the beige Power Ranger. And, and then at the end of the day, I was like, I feel bad. And I was like, I'm not really a Power Ranger. And, the day just kind of ended and we stayed friends, and we never had, I'm sure he gets drunk at parties and is like, I had an idiot friend try to convince me he was a Power Ranger. But
you could still be working that story if you wanted. You could write a book too.
Really? I could, honestly. You heard it here first, folks. Chris Cogswell, secret government Power Ranger, chrononaut, time traveler. It's all great. Anyways. So, Sarah, give us a little bit of your background. How did you get interested in this subject?
Well, I think probably at the same time as a lot of other people, when I got a news alert on my phone from the New York Times telling me that the Defense Department had a UFO program. I saw that, and my first reaction was, well, of course they do. Who would be more interested in some kind of incursion into airspace than the Defense Department? It would be kind of dumb for them not to be investigating unidentified flying objects, not necessarily connected to anything extraterrestrial, but like they have a vested interest in identifying things in the sky of any sort. So at first I didn't pay much attention. And then when I got home the afternoon the story came out, I read it in detail. And I just thought, this is an insane story if there's a lot to back it up. They say they have metal from perhaps some crashed UFOs. They say that this is science fiction. I think the words were, this is like if Leonardo da Vinci got a garage door opener. And I mean, what if he did? And then I had an editor at Wired who sent me just a fairly obscure blog post about this story's connections to Tom DeLonge and this company, To the Stars Academy. And she said, do you want to look into all of this? And so I just started to. And as you well know, it's a hole you can go down kind of forever. And so I've been going down it for the past year and a half or so. And yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, it's so, I think it's really fascinating. It's at the outset, that New York Times story was really, like a lot of the things with To the Stars Academy, it seemed really important. And it seemed like a big deal, like this had never happened before. But then if you've been involved or kind of know the history of this subject, right, you can go back in history and see other times where the government has come out and said, no, we're looking at UFOs. We've been looking at them, And it's kind of funny having if you go to any of these kind of meetings, like a MUFON meeting or a symposium or whatever, it's really funny going to these meetings and having I don't know, having these older people who have been involved in the field for so long kind of patting you on the shoulder and being like, haha, yeah, I can't wait for it to fall to crap for you guys too.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
I can't wait for it to come out that it was all a big hoax and they were tricking
Right.
you all because there's nothing here. They're just trying to protect, their technology or whatever. So I guess for you, what is the most compelling part of this story, or what is the part that really? What do you think? I guess on the outset, what were you most surprised to find out about this story to begin with?
I think after I started digging in, my job is putting together articles myself, and so when I read other people's articles, I start to think about the way they put them together. Like, how did this idea come to them? What evidence do they have to back it up? How many times do they say allegedly or reportedly because they don't have direct evidence themselves necessarily? And I think what was most interesting to me as I started to think more deeply about the story was like how little was actually there, kind of like you said. And so then but what compelled me about the story, and I've been working on a book since last year about UFO culture and kind of this cycle in history of people getting fooled by things maybe, and the government protecting their own interests and perhaps muddying the waters. I met a lot of people when I was working on my first article, researchers in the UFO field who I really identified with in a way I didn't necessarily expect. Like, there's this group of people who do remember the UFO field's history and who get a lot of government documents and do a lot of investigations, like not unlike a journalist would do. And what I found most compelling about the story was how they were handling it and how they did not seem to be fooled. And then also how they came into conflict, as I'm sure we've all seen, especially on Twitter, with the people who did believe this new story.
Yeah, it's for me. So the way that I kind of first got, I mean, I've always been interested in this story from the time I was a kid. Just because, like, I grew up, my mom is like a spooky lady, I guess you would say, generally. Although getting less spooky with age, she's kind of, mellowing out. But, I've always been interested in this kind of stuff. And so when I got into university, I really, I initially thought I wanted to do kind of like theoretical physics work, and then found out that theoretical physicists don't make any money. So I decided to become an engineer with a philosophy degree. So yeah, so that's been a very lucrative choice in my life. That was a good one. But in through philosophy though, the why do people believe weird things? But also, why do people, like you said, why is it that these fields are cyclical? And one of the big things in my mind is that it's a lack of institutional knowledge, or even just a lack of institutions meant to keep that knowledge. I don't know how deeply you've gone into, say, I don't know, kind of the Facebook groups and things and all the clicks and everything else. But I mean, it's a pretty drastic split, where the vast majority of the UFO community, if we can call it a community, right, the people that are interested in this, don't really seem to be buying what To the Stars Academy is selling. But there's a very small subset that is, maybe like 10%, 15%, who have just been introduced to the field and do believe it. And then there's like another maybe 5% of that where they're like, oh, finally, finally the government admits that they've had flying craft this whole time that are floating, and it plays into their overall mythology.
Yeah, and it's been interesting for me since I mean, I didn't really, to be honest, pay attention to ufology or the UFO community for whatever it is, like you said, until this story came out. I was like a lot of the newcomers, but it has been interesting to see just how rabid that 5 or 10% who just kind of came on the scene at the same time as To the Stars can be. And when I started writing about it, when I wrote the first story for Wired, where I kind of called into question the provenance of the videos and the actual evidence behind the original story, like my Twitter mentions just blew up, and some people started making hate videos about me. And I write a ton of articles, and it has never happened to me before. And now, anytime I mention To the Stars or UFOs, it's just like a constant attack from this group of people who are the minority but do really love To the Stars Academy in a way I don't quite understand.
Yeah, they're super vocal about it. It's yeah, it's hard to understand where that kind of it's hard to understand. And that's something that we've been trying to do is pick apart and understand where that level of devotion comes from, because it really has never it's it's never really, I mean, okay, I say it's never been, but there have been UFO cults, like literal cults, right, where people kill themselves. uh, so to some extent it's almost like a continuation of just the radicalization of young men that we see generally in society right now, in my mind. But it's also, I think, a really interesting subset of the community. It almost, to me, you know, it almost feels to me like a street team, like a band street team, like the people that they get involved, or they feel like they're involved, they feel like they're connected. And frankly, part of that is because of how, like, some of the members of To the Stars Academy are super open. Lou Elizondo, evidently, if you go up to him at conferences, he just gives out his cell phone number. People just get to text Lou Elizondo and be like, hey, what's up? Nice episode of Unidentified.
Yeah,
that to me is
do
crazy.
You get to text him? I don't get to text him.
No, I don't. No. They will not talk, especially after this series. They will not talk to me. No, no, they don't. When I was at MUFON, actually, before that whole fiasco blew up, we were in contact with To the Stars Academy, trying to, like, legitimately talk to them, like, hey, you guys have materials you want to see analyzed. I happen to be a PhD in, focusing on the creation and analysis of nanomaterials. Let's get some of your stuff to a lab. And it just never happened. It just never were interested, which was the first ringer that something was a little bit off there, right? Like, why don't they want this stuff to be analyzed?
I mean, the same thing happened to me. Lou Elizondo and Steve Justice were both talking to me when I first started reporting on this topic, and then I talked to the Pentagon and got some contradictory reports about where the UAP videos had come from and what they represented. And I said, hey, Lou Elizondo, what do you think of this? And when it became clear that my narrative was not going to exactly match up with their narrative, they stopped returning my calls, mysteriously.
Yeah, it's interesting how that has happened. I mean, I've, like, on the air, I have called, I don't know, I have been brutal to the leaders of MUFON on this show and on other shows. And yet when I see those leaders at conferences, we give each other a hug and we talk, and you know what I mean? Like, we disagree, but I've never been ghosted in the same way.
It's hurtful.
It's kind of, again, on its own, interesting. Oh my God, I'm crying right now. I'm crying internally. I'll go play some later ages Blink-182 and cry to myself.
Man, I have never listened to more Blink-182 than I have since last December. It really got a renaissance going for me, for better or for worse.
Yeah, it's good stuff, right? It's my wife will now, when I'm getting too clearly agitated by UFO Twitter, my wife will text me just "War you?" right? Like, from like, "War you?" Like, she just comes for me, man. But anyways, so one thing that I think is really interesting with all of this too is the response of the scientific community to all of this has been, there's this mythology in the UFO world that scientists don't want to get involved in this because it'll hurt their careers and things. And yet, in my experience at least, and I don't know if you've had the same experience, but in my experience, scientists are the biggest, kind of sci-fi fans out there. And so maybe they don't want to get involved in, like, ufology, but I have not yet met a scientist who, at a conference, at a work event, just from being friends or whatever, where when I tell them, hey, I've been reading these funny books about UFOs, they're not just generally interested in the subject or topic. I've never had someone be like, oh, that's bullcrap, I don't believe in it.
Yeah, no, neither have I. I was actually pretty reticent to tell people I interview for other stories, because most of what I write about is, astronomical discoveries or space companies or slightly more grounded things like that. And I was nervous to tell people like I'm working on this UFO book, but I've had like a uniformly positive response. Like, that sounds interesting. And you also have scientists like the chair of the astronomy department at Harvard University who suggested that interstellar object that came through the solar system. I don't know if you remember that, was
Yep.
maybe a spaceship, and he caught some heat for that. But at the same time, he's the chair of the astronomy department at Harvard, and there's also a scientist at NASA Ames Research Center, I think, who published a paper suggesting that we should pay more attention to the idea that there might be spacecraft in the solar system or in the atmosphere. And I think scientists' biggest problem is that they like data and reports and evidence. And historically, when UFO researchers have tried to gather that, they either haven't, or in the case of people like Bigelow, which I'm sure you're going to talk about a lot, like he does a lot of research and then we never see the results of what comes out of it. And that's what convinces scientists.
Yeah, it goes into a file folder someplace in the desert
Right.
in Las
Yeah.
Vegas,
We
surrounding
gotta,
Las Vegas.
yeah, we got to go on a
Yeah,
treasure hunt someday.
I'm telling
Find
you,
it. Yeah.
seriously, it's no, it is really interesting, and that's actually one area where we've interviewed in the past psychologists and you know people doing what I hesitate to call the soft sciences, but things like say psychology or sociology, anthropology, these kinds of fields where the I don't think there has ever been a better time in the Western historical overall conversation to talk about why it is that people believe things that seem to have no evidence for them. There's never been a better time.
Yeah,
It
I
is
mean, it's
it
not
is
just
ruining
it's not
things.
just UFOs anymore.
No, it's not, right? Like measles is coming back. It's crazy.
Hmm.
And it and it's just been so funny, my mom again, my mom the other day was like, "Well, it's she texted me after I posted a thing about some crazy UFO thing and she was like, "Do people really believe that?" And I was like, "Yes. Yes, they do. People really believe that and they buy the books and they watch they watch the documentaries and they go to the events. People really believe this stuff." And it's in many cases the same people who believe that vaccines are dangerous, or it's not like that slippery slope that exists is not hard to see its foundations in the UFO field. And so there is a lot, I think, of interesting historical knowledge and just general kind of knowledge about how to combat some of that can be gained from this field.
Yeah, and I think for me, what kind of clarified a lot of people's reactions was I read an essay by a guy named Chris Witkowski. I don't know if you've ever talked to him.
Yes,
Yeah,
Chris is great.
he
Big friend of the show's hosts here. Yes.
awesome. Yeah, I read an essay that he wrote for the book Reframing the Debate that kind of looked at ufology as a modern religion, not just as like a religion, but truly a religion. And just the way that people interact with evidence and claims and things like that is more like that. It's based on feeling and it is based on belief. It's not based on anything to back it up. And no matter how much evidence or lack of evidence you throw at someone, like they're not going to change their mind because it's not based in what it claims to be based in, which is like
Yeah.
science. So
No, absolutely. And so I don't know how much you've been able to really look at, say, the science portion of things about this field. But for instance, I completely agree with Chris's analysis of it being almost, it being a new religion that, and it has all the hallmarks. Even the collection of evidence process is nearly a ritualistic behavior because again, there's not a lot of it's not there is not a lot of verifiable science that can come from those investigations. And even if you go to say like a MUFON meeting, it is very much so it's closer to almost a like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting
yeah.
where and I say that with all seriousness. It really is like that because it's people that get together. They in many cases may not have other places to go in terms of on a Saturday or whatever, and they'll go. They have a community of people who think like them, who have had similar frightening experiences, maybe that they can't explain. And it is almost more of a thing about, I don't know how much of it is about investigation as it is about healing in terms of their experiences. But anyways, that, getting to the point of the scientific question here, right? Have you had a chance yet to look at some of the statistical data that exists currently, or have you really not been able to look at that yet?
In terms of sightings and things,
Yes.
I have looked at other people's analysis of that. I listened to some of yours, and I've looked at some of Cheryl Costa's analysis
Yes.
of things like that. And I think both of you have found that a lot of the claims about where things tend to show up and what they're up to are like don't stand up. Like I think she or maybe you, the claim that they like
Accurate.
show up near nuclear facilities is not true.
Yes.
Things like that.
Yes.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. 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 No, that's something. I guess one thing that I have found to be very interesting with this is, or the reason I bring this up is, if you had to come up with a survey, or if you had to study this scientifically, where would you start?
That's a good question. I think, and maybe this is my own personal bias because I write a lot about the satellite industry, but there are satellites watching pretty much all of Earth all of the time right now, and those and organizations like NORAD, but NORAD's a little more closed, and these are just private companies that have no restrictions on their data. Like you could get that data, you could go buy it, you could get a subscription to something that yeah, takes pictures of the whole planet every day. And if there's something as kind of ubiquitous as ufology kind of implies going on, you should be able to see something like that. Or, I mean, for claims like To the Stars is making, like you said about the metamaterials or whatever, the samples they have, like it's not a mystery how you would figure out if those were mysterious or not. Like we have the technology, we can figure these things out. And if there's radar data for those sightings, like let's get it. I personally am never going to be convinced by anyone's personal account. I don't think, not even my own if I had one, just because humans are so fallible and our brains are so bad at interpreting things. I think I would start with that kind of hard data.
Yeah, I agree with you there. It's one part of this that I find to be really fascinating, actually, is talking to people who maybe have never had an experience like this, but who still believe. I often just kind of want to ask them, like, have you never misremembered something? Like you've never had even. I saw it today on Reddit, or not on Reddit, actually, on the Hysteria 51 Facebook page. The Fruit of the Loom logo doesn't have a cornucopia on it, and my brain literally was like melting. I was like, "What do you mean it doesn't have a cornucopia? Of course it does." And no, it's
Right.
never had it, right? Or the Berenstain Bears versus the Bernstein Bears. Those kinds of things happen all the time to us, and they happen on a social level too, not even like an individual level. So how could you possibly think that you couldn't just be mistaken about something? It's hard
Yeah,
to.
I mean,
It's
yeah,
hard
you
to
can have two
gauge.
eyewitnesses to a crime standing next to each other, report different things. You can tell someone they had a memory of something when they were a kid, and then they will make up a memory that kind of matches that. Like, there's research that shows this. It's not like calling any eyewitness a liar. Like, our brains are just bad at memory.
Our brains are bad at memory. That is an accurate statement, 100%. Getting back to, I guess, kind of more of the To the Stars Academy discussion here, the questions. One of the most fascinating things for me has been how successfully Robert Bigelow, and again, we don't know for certain that he's involved in To the Stars Academy. It's just like, I don't know, if I made the example the other night on our radio show that, it's like if Robin showed up at a crime scene to investigate, it would make sense to think that Batman will probably get involved or had something to do with it. It's kind of that way with Pudoff and Bigelow. Like, if Pudoff's there, Bigelow's probably somewhere in the shadows, scowling. So, so Bigelow's ability to actually have transitioned this from an interest in space generally, maybe. I mean, he had an experience, or his family had an experience when he was a kid that led to him being interested in UFOs. He grew up in an area that was rife with UFO sightings and things during the time period. actually, he did it, right? Like he built himself up and is, has modules going into space currently. Um, that's an amazing story to me, and it's one that I'm surprised that more of, I guess, the scientific media hasn't looked at or even looked into. Why do you think that is?
Why do I think they haven't looked into it?
Yeah, I guess, or
I
yeah,
mean,
I don't know.
I think something Robert Bigelow has always had going for him is that he did make himself into a very successful businessman, first with his hotels and then with these very real space modules, that have gone to the space station. And he's a major player in the like NASA economic ecosystem. And I think that gives him a lot of credibility that other people might have. Like if you're an eccentric billionaire, you can have eccentric interests and people still take you seriously. Like NASA will still give you contracts. And I don't exactly know why the media hasn't paid attention to him, but my cynical answer is that all of the coverage of ATIP and To the Stars Academy has kind of been driven by To the Stars Academy putting forth stories. And if they don't put forth the narrative about Robert Bigelow, then it's easier for whoever's writing the story just not to go investigate that, like to take what's given to them. Like journalists are busy, and
Mm.
I think maybe it's easier just to take that story. There is, I don't have the link in front of me, but the first time I wrote a story about Robert Bigelow, it was just about his inflatable module that was going to the space station, and my editor said you should read this story that Wired published, this profile of Robert Bigelow a long time ago, maybe like in the early mid 2000s, that did kind of look at this history of his interest, but that was they hadn't done it since then. So
Yeah, no, that's actually one of our that is one of our sources for our series on Bigelow. So it'll be in the show notes, folks. But I mean, honestly, I think I actually think partly it's because, like you said, uh, Bigelow has had a really good or really Bigelow is really effective at frankly, keeping his secrets because he doesn't do social media. A lot of these UFO personalities, like even say like Richard Doty, has a Facebook profile. You can message Richard Doty on Facebook. You can tweet at George Knapp and he'll retweet you. A lot of these personalities are very open, and it's because it's part of their business model. They need to be open because they need to be visible. Because if they're not visible, then people will just forget about them. Bigelow is part of a crowd that's been very good at keeping things close to the chest. And that's actually kind of played into his mythos, I think, as this kind of mysterious, brooding, evil genius, or maybe not evil genius, but just genius.
yeah, and I mean maybe it helps that he is not trying to make his money for the most part on
Well, that,
UFOs. Like he doesn't
yeah,
need that. He made his money already.
I think that absolutely helps too. And he even says that in some of his interviews that he gave earlier on in his life. He talks about how his plan, he says that his plan all along was to start funding this stuff once he had enough money that people had to take him seriously. And it's honestly worked amazingly well. It's like it worked like a charm. This guy started from a couple of housing units in Las Vegas and has built it into a community that does, like you said, have to take him seriously just by the sheer weight of his ability to throw around money. He's like the $10 billion elephant in the room.
And then I think, when although he keeps a lot of his research funding quiet, something Jack Brewer of the UFO Trail said to me when I was interviewing him is like, when this serious business person, Robert Bigelow, takes a shine to you and funds you to do some kind of UFO or paranormal research, like you get a little bit of that validity like bestowed onto you. So it's kind of like an honor to have Robert Bigelow be funding your research. And I think that keeps people probably from asking maybe more questions than they should.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also interesting, though, looking at the history of the things that he's funded and how many of them have kind of, a lot of it too, because it is the UFO community and because this is almost a field where it's almost like trying to study folklore. It's like word of mouth is really important because people just didn't, in the 1990s, people didn't think to write this stuff down for some reason. But so, like trying to figure out what the Bigelow Foundation actually funded it has been a real challenge for us. And the only ways that we've been able to pick apart some of the things that the Bigelow Foundation funded, besides like looking at, tax documents and whatever for it, is looking at people's self-published biographies on like exopolitics.org or those kinds of things, and then seeing it corroborated or at least not pulled down by Bigelow. It's a really fascinating thing. I mean, he's been involved in some things that people don't even realize. He was one of the initial founders of Art Bell's Coast to Coast radio show.
Mm-hmm.
He helped fund that. Or at least helped fund the initial version of it with George Knapp and Linda Moulton Howe. He helped fund some of Stanton Friedman's research. He had a contract with Bob Lazar for a time period before Lazar tried to give him like Pine Sol and say it was element 115. There's a lot of stories like that out there that he funded people and then realized that he was he was throwing money. He was just throwing bad money. He was bad money after good, so it didn't make sense to continue funding it. But that's actually been one of the most fascinating parts of this for me, at least, is yes, Bigelow giving you money is a big vote of confidence, I would say. But for some reason, Bigelow then taking away money isn't considered a vote of no confidence.
Yeah, try to make sense of that. And I mean, I think what's a shame about it, I think, is that based on all of this and the long lists I've seen, that it sounds like you've seen also, of the people he's funded, even if we don't know all the projects, like he must have the largest private collection of data on all of this stuff as anyone. And if ufology wants to be treated like science, like I said before, then you have to, you release results, you publish reports, you make them public, and you let people try to reproduce them. And I think it's a shame that there's all this data, even if it's data that came to nothing, that's just sitting maybe in a paper file somewhere, since he doesn't like computers so much, but somewhere.
Yeah. It's a it almost seems like it would be a shame if, and I mean, we wish him a good, good health and a long life, obviously, but if when he passes away, there isn't the founding of like the Bigelow Library of Parapsychology, you know what I mean? Like that, those documents should go someplace, we would hope. But honestly, that is what's happened though in this field consistently, is people have documents like this, and then when they die, those documents simply get thrown away. It happened to a lot of the original paperwork and information surrounding MUFON. A lot of those original case files just kind of blew to the wind, which has been a real shame, I think. Because again, sometimes bad results tell you more than good results do. You can pinpoint away from things, testing that won't work, ideas that aren't true. You can still get information there. So one aspect of this story that we're looking into for this series that I think hasn't really been, well, it's been talked about, but not really taken very seriously, is the idea that perhaps To the Stars Academy is some kind of disinformation group. And I don't know how much I believe that. You know what I mean? I think Tom DeLonge is super genuine in his belief, frankly, almost to the point of like embarrassing other members of To the Stars Academy. He really believes this stuff and he really thinks it. But I do think it's fascinating, the connection between, say, some of these people and, say, the disinformation groups that we suspect, at least, or we have evidence that they existed during, say, the period of like the 1980s to the 1990s, with, say, Paul Benowitz or, other, like, to me, the connection between Paul Benowitz and Bigelow is fascinating. It's not an actual connection. I mean, some people, in common, right? Linda Moulton Howe and whatever, but the idea that there were these two kind of eccentric millionaires at the time looking into UFOs and other paranormal things, and one of them cracked under kind of the pressure, supposedly. I mean, not supposedly. He did end up in an asylum, but that one of them seemed to have cracked under this, and the other one seemed to have been almost refined by it. You know what I mean? That to me is a very fascinating part of this story. What do you make of those connections? What do you think about that kind of
Yeah, I mean,
narrative?
I think it's another example of a potential cycle in the interaction between the government and ufology. And I guess I wouldn't fall over with surprise if I found out that something similar was happening again. Into the Stars was a disinformation campaign. I don't have enough evidence to believe that myself at the moment, but I
Mhm.
think what makes more sense to me, although I also don't have enough evidence to say I believe this either, is that like it's somehow in the government's interest to just kind of let this ride, to let people continue to be confused and believe what they want, so that they don't pay attention, maybe either to advanced technology that we have or advanced technology from another country that is somehow a threat to us. And like what is interesting to me is how um, the Pentagon isn't going after Lou Elizondo for releasing these videos that it looks like he wasn't supposed to release, and they're not like issuing very many correctional statements. They could clear all of this confusion up with one single press release, and they're not doing it. And so I think, like in the past, where top secret projects have kind of remained top secret in part by letting people think like what they see as a UFO, so that serious people don't take them seriously, it makes sense to me that that could be happening again.
Yeah, yeah. It's I think the point you make about the government not clearing up any of the statements of Lou Elizondo, or even even say, I mean, one of the, I think the most egregious displays of this is the Italian government, which my and I say this with all due love to Italy because my family is Italian, my mom is from Italy. The Italian government is not necessarily the most put together at the moment. Um, so all due respect to that, but to me, it is an egregious display of inaccuracy to call the Italian version of MUFON the Italian military on unidentified. Like that's just not the case. Just because some guys were in the Italian military and one of them, it appears, was given an honorary title, doesn't mean that they're the Italian military taking this seriously. But whatever. It is interesting that they don't clear it up, and I think that there is a case to be made that there's something there to say. Again, we're a lot of people here are arguing about UFOs, people that maybe in other cases would be worried about technologies that might not be good for our society that we are developing, right? Facial recognition technologies and artificial intelligence and whatever, any number of these things. They're not worried about those things. They're not worried about real concerns with technology. They're worried about Lou Elizondo
Yeah,
going on a
right.
podcast.
I mean, from a
It's
psychological
a great,
perspective, it's
yeah.
easier to like deflect your emotions about real things, maybe onto maybe not real things, and to just maybe take like this general feeling of threat. Like honestly, it feels like the world could end basically any day, uh, to
Yeah,
me.
no, I
And
agree,
like
100%.
you just
Yes,
take that feeling and displace it onto something else, and then you just worry about UFOs instead of worrying about nuclear war with North Korea.
right, right, yeah, yeah, and it's and maybe the UFOs will save us from the nuclear war, right? Maybe they're friendly.
Yeah,
Yay,
I
that'll be
would accept
great.
that. Yeah.
Oh, me too. It'd be awesome. One other part of this that I think is not getting a lot of play, but I think is honestly the most fascinating part of the story, is just how easy it seems to have been for Robert Bigelow to like buy a government program. Like he talked to Harry Reid and he's like, "Hey, I'm gonna keep giving you money, but I think we should look at UFOs." And Harry Reid's like, "You know, that's a very convincing argument you make, giant pile of money. We're going to do that. We're going to found ATIP, and we're going to, to me, a big part of this story is about government corruption and the power that money has on, I guess, the scientific process generally. And we see this with other stories too, with, the revelations that there were, really, really high level scientists going and talking to Jeffrey Epstein about creating like an Epstein clone island army. You know what I mean? Like that is crazy to me. That the influence that money can have in this kind of way. Um, what do you think that's an important part of this story, or do you think that this is just? Do you suspect that ATIP was going to come out before Bigelow helped, or Bigelow kind of pushed for it to be funded? Do you think that's part of their overall mythology of To the Stars Academy, or do you think there's really something to that?
I mean, I think I don't know for sure, I should say first. But I mean, no, I think that's a big part of the
Sure.
story, that money and connections get things done. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that Robert Bigelow was a donor to Harry Reid, and that he is a very influential person in the state of Nevada. And the way the narrative about how the program got funded makes me think that there's probably a lot of programs in the government that kind of work this way. Like, I'm interested in doing this thing. Okay, let's do this thing. Here's some millions of dollars that are a lot to regular people, but are not necessarily a lot to the defense budget. And then because they do kind of like fly under the radar, then there's not a whole lot of oversight around what they're doing. And that seems to be the case with ATIP, that maybe the officials at the actual Pentagon weren't really aware of what Robert Bigelow was doing out in the desert in a full kind of way. And I mean, to your point about Epstein, I think there are these circles of connection and influence and prestige where you can get away with a whole lot if you're a person with money and you're a scientist who wants money, because there's a lot of defense money, but there's not actually a ton of science money, and scientists are always fighting over it. So when one of these rich guys like turns their eye towards you and says, "Do you want some?" That's very attractive, even if they're not a great person.
Yeah, I likened it on this show actually to like going to one of those timeshare meetings to get a set of golf clubs. You just kind of you go, you hear the spiel, and you kind of think in your head you're like, this is so dumb, I'm never going to do this, and then you leave. If you have to sit through an hour of some dumb billionaire being like, you know, and then we're going to strap rockets to the boots, and then the bears will fly to the moon, and we'll have bear colonies. If you have to sit through that to get $2 million in funding for your project that is free of any kind of, I hesitate to say oversight, but it's not linked to any kind of it's like scientific fund money, right? It's just money you can spend on stuff you want to look into but would never get the funding to do otherwise. That is very appealing. I wonder. Part of me wonders if there aren't more programs like ETIP out there, and not even say in terms of like UFOs, but just in terms of like pet projects that the business world think would be great, or individual donors think would be really useful. I mean, I wonder if there's not some like secret, I don't know, program studying, I don't know, genetically modified corn or something in like the USDA, and it's some eccentric, corn millionaire funding it. It seems like it's crazy to think that Bigelow would be the only one that was able to buy this kind of access. I have to think that there are other programs like this out there that we would be, I don't know, as a society, kind of flabbergasted that we were spending, tens of billions of dollars a year on it. But
Yeah,
I don't
for
know.
sure. I mean, I think the fact that one came to light means there's probably a lot more. And I mean, you see it in lots of scientific studies, and people are getting better about reporting on it. Just the conflicts of interest that come with that, like, is industry funding that GMO corn study at the USDA, or is like Coca-Cola funding sugar studies and stuff like that? And I think people are getting
Mhm.
better as the world becomes more transparent at figuring that stuff out, but there's surely much more of it than we know about.
Yeah, no, for sure. So, well, with the last kind of 10 minutes here, I guess I wanted to get your take. What if you had to say what do you think the top five biggest? You give me a rundown, right? What are you the most concerned about for, I guess, public understanding of science in the next couple of years? What do you think are the biggest issues or the biggest things you'd like to see corrected in the public's mind about science, or about, I'm talking like, anti-vaccinations or whatever, right? What do you think those would be?
Wow, that's a big question. Um,
I know we keep ending these with like hard. I think every single one of these interviews has ended with people being like, "Oh my god, that's a question. Why didn't you give me this earlier?" So that's my bad. Maybe that's me not being a great interviewer. But
Pull it
anyways,
on. Well, so I am going to start with a UFO one, and then I'll go on to different ones. But I think, I think that if there are alien spaceships visiting the world, which is a thing I don't myself believe, but is a thing that has been implied repeatedly in the media and by places like To the Stars, like I have a lot of questions about that, and I would like to get it cleared up. So I mean, I think as a person who spent the past year and a half of her life working on stuff like that, I would ask questions about that. I think anti-vaccination is a big one because I personally don't want to die in an epidemic. I do have vaccines. Uh, Climate change it is already changing and it's gonna change life for everybody. So questions about like how do you actually get industry and countries to cooperate on moving forward with that, and then like how do we adjust to the like changing reality that will exist even if we do better. Let's see, that's three. You said five. It's such a big question.
it doesn't have to be five. I think those were some good. Those were a good three. I think those were really nice three there. But if you have others, I mean, you just pipe in, just come up with them. It's all good.
No, we'll stick with three. Those are big ones that I think lots of people would agree with me, except for maybe about UFOs.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with all three. I think it's interesting. Yeah, I guess another kind of question that I had for you really was, have you had the experience yet of have you talked to like an experiencer yet? Like someone who thinks they were abducted actually?
No, I have not. I thought about doing it for the research I was doing for working on the book, and then in the end, I decided that I only wanted to write about people who I could like talk about their experience in a respectful way, and I
Yes.
wasn't confident that I could do that with an experiencer, so I ended up leaving it out.
Yeah, no, I think actually that's one of the most important. I commend you very much for even considering that in the first place, because honestly, it's something that people don't. I don't know. People don't consider that these are real people who are, you know, it was easy coming into this field thinking that, well, it's never happened to me, so there's no way it's happened to anybody. And then you go to an event and you talk to somebody who's like, literally shaking and crying and upset and telling this story that really negatively affected them. And you kind of walk away where you're like, I don't know what happened to that person, but something terrible happened.
Yeah.
And I don't, you don't know what it is, but I think really it's something that needs to be addressed more, because there are people that are really getting hurt by something, and I don't know what it is, but they're first off being victimized by whatever experience traumatizes them, but then they are subsequently being victimized by being lied to, by being sold remedies that will not work, and in some cases by literally being victimized further by having dangerous psychological tests and methods done on them in
Right.
someone's basement.
Yeah,
You
I mean, I
know,
think there's a lot of hucksters and hoaxers out there, but I don't think they're the individual people who have experiences. I think they're the people making money off of the people who have experiences. And so, yeah, I'm fine taking those
yes,
people to task, the people with the solutions and the books and the videos. But I don't think it's good to further victimize, like you said, people who truly believe what they're saying, whether it's true or not.
yeah, absolutely. No, it's a fine line. It can be hard, but it's, I don't know. You just got to be kind. Just don't be jerks, people. Be nice. Come on,
Yeah.
especially on the internet. It's funny actually. Point of advice, and I mean, I'm sure you don't really even need this, but the only two groups that we have ever gotten like legitimate like harassment from are To the Stars Academy supporters and people who think that they have super mega
Oh,
Lyme
interesting.
disease. Those are the
what's
only
what's
two
the Venn
groups.
diagram of those two groups?
It's surprisingly small, actually. Um, it's actually has been really funny. Like you would expect it to be bigger because you'd think, well, maybe Lyme disease is like a government program used to control the aliens. You know, you can come up with all kinds of mythologies, right? Somehow that cross-pollination has never happened. But in either case, from those groups, I have learned that I am a stupid science shill, who's really doing harm to the truth. So it's been nice.
Well, I'm a government disinformation agent, so.
Oh, congrats. Man, when do we get our checks this month? I don't understand. I haven't been paid yet.
I don't know. Yeah, I should definitely have better health insurance if that's true.
Right? So. Ridiculous. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to the Mad Scientist podcast. I've been your host, Chris Cogswell, here again with our guest, Sarah Scoles. Sarah, thanks so much for coming on. Anything you want to leave the listeners with? Anything you'd like them to go check out?
Sure. My Twitter handle is Scoles Sarah, Scoles Sarah. And the book I wrote about the UFO community called They Are Already Here, UFO Culture and Why We See Saucers, is you can pre-order it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble when it comes out in March.
Bestseller science list! Yes! All right. Thank you so much for listening, dear listeners. We'll be back in a week with our next episode. Thank you again, dear listeners, for listening to the Mad Scientist podcast. I have been your host, Chris Cogswell, joined by my co-host,
Marie Mayhew.
If you'd like to contact the show, please send us an email at themadscientistpodcast@gmail.com. That's all one word. You can also follow us on Twitter at MadScientistPod or at Team Giant Squid for Marie. And of course, you can see us on Facebook, on Instagram, and all over the internet as the Mad Scientist Podcast. And again, our logo is the one with the pumpkin head, so it's easy to see.
Mm-hmm.
If you've enjoyed the show tonight, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where the money that you give to us will help us to promote this show further, to make it better, and just to spend more time making it.
Yes, we love doing that.
We do love doing that. Our logo was designed by Carrie Shaheen. Our web design is done by Desdemona Howard.
Woohoo!
And our sound design is done by Jake Cardinal. Thanks again for listening.
Thank you. This has been a Damn It Chippy production.